Let's talk about Alexander the Great. You know him, you love him. He's the guy who conquered half the known world before he was old enough to rent a car. For over a century, the Kingdom of Macedonia had been coasting on Alexander's reputation. They were the cool kids club of the Mediterranean. They had the history, the prestige, and most importantly, they had the Phalanx, a tactical formation so spiky and impenetrable that fighting it was like trying to hug a pissed-off porcupine. But by the 2nd century BC, there was a new bully on the playground: Rome. And Rome didn't care about your cool backstory or your vintage pike collection. Rome had just finished body slamming Carthage and Hannibal into the dust, and they were looking for their next punching bag. Enter King Perseus of Macedon. He wasn't a bad guy, really. He just wanted to make Macedonia great again. He started fixing the economy, making friends with his neighbors, and generally being a competent ruler. Naturally, Rome found this absolutely terrifying. You see, the Roman Senate suffered from a chronic condition known as paranoid superpower syndrome. If a neighbor sneezed without asking for permission, Rome assumed it was an act of war. When Perseus started gaining popularity in Greece, the Senate clutched their pearls and screamed, "He's trying to destroy us." Probably, maybe. So in 171 BC, Rome decided to launch the Third Macedonian War. Their casus belli? Essentially, we don't like your face, Perseus. The Romans expected a quick walk in the park. They expected the Macedonians to roll over like a good little client state. But as the first Roman legions landed in Greece, they quickly realized that this wasn't going to be a vacation. The ghost of Alexander still had some fight left in him. You would think that the Roman war machine, fresh off defeating the legendary Hannibal, would crush Macedonia like a grape under a sandal. You would be wrong. For the first 3 years of the war, the Roman performance was less unstoppable juggernaut and more drunk uncle trying to assemble IKEA furniture. The Senate sent a conga line of consuls to Greece, each one more incompetent than the last. First up was Publius Licinius Crassus. In 171 BC, he met Perseus at the Battle of Callinicus. It was a cavalry engagement, and Perseus absolutely wiped the floor with him. Perseus, being a sensible guy who didn't actually want to fight a superpower to the death, immediately offered peace terms. He basically said, "Look, you tried, I won, let's call it a draw and go get some souvlaki." Rome's response? A hard no. Because in the Roman playbook, admitting you lost a battle is illegal. They demanded total, unconditional surrender. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a toddler plugging their ears and screaming until they got their way. So the war dragged on, and on. For 3 agonizing years, Roman armies stumbled through the mountains of Greece, accomplishing nothing but getting heat stroke and dysentery. The discipline of the legions, usually their trademark, completely evaporated. Soldiers were wandering off to loot local farms, officers were taking naps during drills, and the consuls were too busy trying to get rich to actually fight. Back in Rome, the Senate was furious. Their prestige was tanking. Their allies were starting to giggle behind their backs. They realized that if they didn't stop sending C-list celebrities to lead the army, they might actually lose this thing. They needed a fixer. They needed a man who ate gravel for breakfast and shat victory. They needed Lucius Aemilius Paullus. Lucius Aemilius Paullus was not a fun guy at parties. He was 60 years old, which in ancient Roman years is basically 112, and he had previously retired after earning a triumph in Spain. He only accepted this new command on one condition: everyone had to shut up and do exactly what he said. He was basically the angry dad who pulls the car over to yell at the kids in the back seat. When Paullus arrived at the Roman camp in Greece in early 168 BC, he found less of an army and more of a heavily armed frat house. Discipline was non-existent. Soldiers were trading their swords for local wine, sentries were sleeping on duty, and the only drilling they were doing was trying to drill holes in wine casks. Paullus immediately canceled the party. He implemented a training regime so strict it made Spartan boot camp look like a yoga retreat. He famously told the soldiers, "Your job is to carry your shield and sword. My job is to do the thinking. If I want your opinion, I'll beat it out of you." He worked them until they puked, and then he worked them some more. He restored the supply lines and kicked out the camp followers. Within weeks, the sloppy mob had transformed back into the terrifying Roman fighting machine. The vacation was over. It was time to go find King Perseus and introduce him to the new management. Paullus marched his shiny new army south until they ran into King Perseus, who had parked himself behind the Elpis River. Perseus had dug trenches, built forts, and mounted catapults everywhere. It was basically an impregnable fortress of nope. A lesser general would have ordered a frontal charge and watched his career end in a river of blood. But Paullus was an old pro. He looked at the defenses, did the math, and realized that attacking head-on was the tactical equivalent of trying to stop a chainsaw with your face. So, he decided to cheat. Paullus called up a young officer named Scipio Nasica. He gave Nasica 8,000 men and told them to go on a little hike. That hike turned out to be a grueling night march over the slopes of Mount Olympus. Yes, that Mount Olympus, where Zeus lives. The plan was to loop around the mountain and hit Perseus from the rear. It was a risky move, but it worked. The Macedonian guards stationed in the mountain passes were, let's just say, less than attentive. They were probably busy napping or arguing about philosophy when the Romans showed up. When Perseus realized there was a Roman army suddenly appearing behind him, he panicked. If he stayed put, he'd be surrounded. So, he abandoned his fancy fortress and booked it north to the plains of Pydna. It was a flat, open field, the absolutely perfect terrain for a phalanx. Perseus thought he had saved the day. In reality, he had just walked into the kill box. On the night of June 21st, 168 BC, both armies were camped near Pydna, staring at each other across a small stream. The tension was thick enough to cut with a gladius. But before the humans could start killing each other, the universe decided to pull a prank. A lunar eclipse. To a modern person, this is just celestial mechanics. To an ancient Macedonian soldier, this was a glowing red neon sign from the gods saying, "Your king is going to die." Panic swept through the Macedonian camp like a sale at a toga store. They started banging bronze pans and screaming at the sky to scare away the moon demons. Morale plummeted faster than a lead balloon. Over in the Roman camp, things were chill. Why? Because they had a nerd. A military tribune named Gaius Sulpicius Gallus had actually predicted the eclipse. He had gathered the soldiers earlier and explained, "Listen up, meatheads. The moon is going to get dark. It's not magic, it's just shadows. Do not freak out." Even though Paullus knew it was science, he was still a Roman, which means he was superstitious as hell. Just to cover his bases, he sacrificed 11 heifers to the moon once it reappeared. You know, just in case the nerd was wrong and the moon was actually hungry for beef. By the next morning, the Romans were rested, well-fed, and confident. The Macedonians were exhausted from a night of screaming at celestial bodies. The stage was set, the armies formed up, but oddly enough, neither general wanted to start the fight first. It took a runaway horse to kick off the carnage. History is often decided by great men making great speeches, but sometimes it's decided by two idiots fighting over a donkey. Around 3 p.m., a pack animal from the Roman side escaped its handlers and trotted across the shallow river to the Macedonian side for a drink. The Roman handlers chased it. The Thracian guards on the other bank tried to capture it. Words were exchanged. Insults about mothers were yelled. Then, someone threw a rock. Within minutes, what started as a dispute over livestock turned into a full-blown riot. Perseus, watching from his camp, saw the commotion and decided, good enough. He ordered the entire Macedonian army to form up and cross the river. This was it. The phalanx was coming out to play. Now, looking at a phalanx on a diagram is one thing. Seeing a wall of sharp metal points walking toward your face is another. The sight was so terrifying that General Paullus later admitted to his friends in Rome that he almost wet his toga. He ripped his tunic in frustration and prayed to Mars, presumably saying something like, "Please don't let me die in front of these teenagers." The massive hedge of spears smashed into the Roman front line. The Roman legionaries, brave as they were, couldn't get close enough to use their short swords. They were hacking at the pikes, trying to grab them, trying to push them aside, but for every pike they broke, 3 more stabbed them in the chest. The Romans were being pushed back. Step by bloody step, the phalanx was grinding them into dust. It looked like the age of the legion was about to end before it really began. The Roman line was crumbling. They were retreating toward the rough ground of the foothills behind them. To the casual observer, it looked like a rout, but this retreat was about to become the biggest Uno reverse card in military history. You see, the Macedonian Phalanx is a lot like a Formula 1 car. On a perfect flat track, it's a masterpiece of engineering, but if you drive it off-road, it falls apart instantly. As the Phalanx pushed forward, they hit the uneven terrain. A ditch here, a bush there, a slight incline, and suddenly, the perfect wall of death started to look like a gap-toothed smile. Paullus, watching from his horse, saw the formation crack. He didn't order a mass countercharge. Instead, he utilized the superpower of the Roman legion, flexibility. He ordered his centurions to break their cohorts into small groups, maniples, and dive into the gaps like water flowing through a leaking dam. This was the nightmare scenario for a phalangite. The Sarissa pike is 18 feet long. It's great for stabbing a guy 3 zip codes away, but if a Roman with a shield and a short sword gets inside your guard, you are essentially holding a giant, useless stick. The Macedonians tried to drop their pikes and draw their daggers, but it was pathetic. It was like bringing a letter opener to a chainsaw fight. The heavy Roman shield smashed into the light Macedonian armor, and the Spanish sword did the rest. The battle transformed from a clash of lines into 1,000 tiny massacres. If the infantry battle was a disaster for Macedonia, the situation on the flanks was a straight-up horror movie. Remember those elephants Rome brought? They weren't just for parades. While the center was getting chopped up like a salad, the Roman right wing unleashed the beasts. The Macedonian left wing had never really figured out how to deal with several tons of angry, armored meat running at them at 30 miles per hour. The elephants hit the line like a bowling ball, hitting pins made of flesh and bad decisions. It wasn't a battle. It was a trampling event. With the flanks crushed and the center infiltrated, the Macedonian army didn't just retreat, it evaporated. The Phalanx, once the most feared military formation on earth, turned into a panicked mob trapped in a kill box. The Roman legionaries, now in a frenzy, stopped fighting and started butchering. The entire battle lasted less than 1 hour. Let me repeat that, 1 hour. You take longer to decide what to watch on Netflix than it took Rome to dismantle the successor to Alexander the Great. In 60 minutes, 20,000 Macedonians were killed and 11,000 captured. The Romans, they lost maybe 100 guys. The kill-death ratio was so lopsided that modern gamers would call it hacking. The sea turned red with blood. The historian Plutarch wrote that people were still dredging Macedonian coats of arms out of the rivers 2 days later. It was absolute total domination. The rigidity of the pike had lost to the flexibility of the sword, and the world would never look the same. While the Macedonian infantry was being turned into shish kebabs, where was King Perseus? Was he leading a glorious last stand? Was he dying with honor? No. He was busy inventing the Irish goodbye. Perseus and his entire cavalry force, which, by the way, had barely suffered a scratch, noped out of the battle the moment things got dicey. They ghosted their own infantry so hard it was genuinely awkward. Perseus rode straight to his capital, Pella, where he proceeded to have a complete mental breakdown. He blamed his generals, burned his furniture, and threw his treasury into the sea, and then immediately sent divers to go get it back because he realized being poor sucks. He eventually fled to the island of Samothrace, seeking sanctuary in a temple, but Rome wasn't about to respect "tag you can't get me" rules. The Roman navy blockaded the island, and Perseus finally surrendered to Paullus. When they met, Perseus threw himself on the ground, crying and grabbing Paulus's knees. It was so pathetic that Paullus actually looked away in secondhand embarrassment. With the king captured, the Senate decided it was time to perform surgery on the Macedonian state. They didn't just want to defeat Macedonia, they wanted to delete it. They took the kingdom, a unified power for centuries, and smashed it into 4 separate, weak republics. They banned the cutting of timber, closed the gold mines, and made it illegal for people in one district to marry or trade with people in another. It was the geopolitical equivalent of sending an entire nation to its room and telling it to stare at the wall forever. The kingdom of Alexander was dead. Back in Rome, Aemilius Paullus celebrated his victory with a triumph that lasted 3 whole days. This wasn't just a parade, it was a 3-day festival of look how rich we are. Day 1 was just statues and art. Day 2 was weapons. Day 3 was the main event. Mountains of gold, the royal family in chains, and Paullus himself looking smug in a purple toga. The loot from Macedonia was so insane that the Roman government officially told its citizens, "Hey, good news. We have so much money now that nobody has to pay direct taxes anymore." They literally canceled taxes for over 100 years. If that isn't the greatest victory in human history, I don't know what is. As for poor Perseus, his ending was less festive. After being paraded through the streets like a circus animal, he was thrown into a dungeon in Alba Fusians. Legend has it, the guards killed him by simply refusing to let him sleep, poking him awake every time he dozed off until his brain melted. A brutal end for the last heir of Alexander's empire. The Battle of Pydna was the final nail in the coffin for the Greek phalanx. The rigid, spiky hedgehog that had dominated warfare for centuries was officially obsolete, replaced by the flexible, meat grinder efficiency of the Roman legion. The Mediterranean wasn't a contested space anymore, it was a Roman lake. The Republic had crushed the West, and now it had crushed the East. The world didn't just belong to Rome, it was Rome.